Welcome to the annual conference of the Catholic Social Workers National Association, which was held on July 26 through July 28, 2013, at Marytown Shrine of Maximilian Kolbe in Libertyville, Illinois. Peter Breen, Vice President Attorney at St. Thomas More Society from Chicago, Illinois, will be speaking on the impact of the HHS mandate on social work profession.
Well, good afternoon. I have to try to speak loudly and clearly in order so that you don't fall asleep after lunch. Yes, and I'm an attorney, which is a bad thing, so we're normally not that interesting. I want to set the stage here because I was asked to talk on how the HHS mandate impacts you as social workers. And the answer to that question also implicates other areas of religious liberty. And so I think you have to take a broader view of the place where we find ourselves today in this religious liberty battle, because there's a very practical impact on you in terms of insurance. It's an impact on our agencies that have a Catholic or other religious bent. And it impacts you personally too. And it may even impact some of the work that you do in terms of talking with folks and dealing with these issues. I don't know how much you guys will do counseling of individuals who may be faced with these situations. Probably not a huge amount, but at the same time, I know that you're people of influence in your various communities. And so knowing about the broader context here is helpful for you. In terms of where we are, we've just come off of our second Fortnight for Freedom. So the Catholic bishops last year had started the first Fortnight for Freedom in response to the attacks on our religious liberty. We just had our second one, and it was not maybe as big and bold and notable as the first, but it is a continuing dedicated activity of the bishops to show that the religious liberty issues have not abated since last year. And as well, in this state particularly, we've been dealing with some issues that are being dealt with in various other states too, and I will talk about some of the other threats to religious liberties, such as same-sex marriage, and issues like that you may not necessarily have, you may or may not be dealing with in the particular states where you operate. In Illinois, there is a hot debate going on. We've got civil unions right now, and then have same-sex marriage being debated in our legislature. So we're having to very quickly advise legislators on various options and what the religious liberty implications of different laws will be. Now, a year ago, we were still well away from the time when this HHS birth control mandate would impact religious nonprofits. We're much closer now, and we've had final accommodations now announced by the administration. For many in the Catholic milieu, they will say that is not an acceptable accommodation that the administration has offered. That is something a little more for the moral theologians, but I can at least do some armchair theology on it. And again, but as we set ourselves up here, I may want to I'll back up and give you the introduction. The HHS mandate generally is a mandate on every insurance policy in the country, and that it offer particular preventative services for free. So that includes, and what happened is well, that we didn't necessarily have an objection to. It was the specific preventative services that were chosen by the Health and Human Services Secretary that we object to. That is sterilizations, that is various forms of contraception, including contraceptives that also cause early abortions. Very specifically, that does include medications that do cause an embryo not to implant, and so therefore would be under the Church's definition an abortion, and under anyone's really reasonable definition an abortion. So you've got that as an issue. The fight, as it's laid out, has really come in three places. You've got churches and very directly connected church institutions. You've got the larger group of religious nonprofits, which are kind of in the Protestant terminology, they call those parachurch ministries, which I actually kind of like it. It's kind of a fun, that's a neat way to refer to it. But that can be everything from Catholic charities to pregnancy centers, hospitals, certain schools, depending on whether they're tightly tied to the diet to a particular church or not. A whole massive range of institutions. And particularly here in the United States, I mean, we are a people who have, since the beginning of the country, been founding nonprofit organizations to do things in our communities. That's the way that we naturally have acted. And so this is a large range of institutions here in the middle. And then in the third category are private businesses, private individuals. The way that this HHS mandate has broken down, the church is pretty much in all cases now exempt. That has been made clear. So the church institutions do not have to provide the birth control, the sterilizations, things like that. The real fight has been in the categories 2 and 3. The second category, the administration has taken a different view of what it means to exercise the freedom of religion than we do. As Catholic Christians, and really any Christian would say this, it's a common theme across our denominations, that the Christian faith requires you to go out, and it requires you to feed the hungry, clothe the naked. You have to do these things. It's a command of the gospel. Christians who just stay within the four walls of their church are not good Christians by definition. And so for us, we would say, well, for heaven's sakes, if we've got something called the freedom of religion, the free exercise of religion, if you take a definition of that term that excludes what is primary to the Christian faith, we would say that's a really crabbed interpretation and not accurate when viewed against the intention of the founders of the country, or really of anybody since that time up until very, very recently. So that's the interpretation we would take. The other side would say, well, you have a freedom to worship within the four walls of your church, but once you exit those four walls, you've got no protections. So really this second category, the religiously affiliated nonprofits, where I would imagine a lot of Catholic social workers will find themselves, that is now subject to political negotiation. We would say that should be totally unburdened by these sorts of conscience-threatening activities. The other side will say, well, as an accommodation to you, we will have third parties provide these objectionable services to your employees instead of forcing you to provide them. Now, part of the problem is that for most of us we would say, well, if I'm paying you for insurance and the insurance is forced to provide an objectionable service, then at some level I am subsidizing the objectionable service, even if you try to tell me, well, it's not your premium dollars that are going there, it's actually we're subbing in someone else's. And we have this issue in other areas where, look, money is fungible. So you've maybe reallocated our money to something different. Well, you're taking someone else's money and putting it in its place. Really, aren't we all paying for the same thing? And so there are some difficulties there. And that's an issue. This is part of the Catholic theology that I am not as competent to speak to. I can speak to the law on these things. And I certainly could say it looks odd. It certainly looks like something we would say, this isn't what we would normally as Catholics want to participate in. And there is an issue here too, as we at the Thomas More Society and other nonprofit law firms litigate these cases. Some individuals object to paying, or some companies, some nonprofits object to paying for certain services. So if you were to say, well, you're not going to pay for it, we're going to have someone over here pay for it, well, maybe that works to alleviate their moral objection. Fine. The problem is, in the Catholic perspective, our objection is to participating in the system at all. We have a much broader objection to the use of contraceptives and abortifacients and sterilization, etc. So when you take that little more, it's a more thorough and broad objection to being a part of this at all, there's really very little way to accommodate that other than exempting our organizations altogether. And now I had mentioned there is a third category too, private businesses, private individuals. We actually have 3 different companies that we are representing in various parts of the country, 2 here in the Chicagoland area and 1 out in Michigan, who are part of the lawsuits on the private entity side. And there are numerous lawsuits on private entities, and we're winning most of them on the preliminary phases. I believe we're at least winning them 2-to-1 So for every 2 we've won, we've lost 1 in a preliminary phase. Hobby Lobby was the one that has been in the news lately. That's another one of those institutions, a for-profit institution that objects to paying for and subsidizing or being even a part of this system. And again, that's both Catholic and evangelical and some mainline Protestants who are part of that, business owners, their families, and those businesses. So that's the landscape. And actually, I would say too, just as a side comment, that third category, obviously the folks on the other side don't even, they would say that private individuals have absolutely no rights in the marketplace to exercise their religion as we would see it. What you've seen, this has been a little bit of a change from the bishops' conference and from individual bishops. A lot of the rhetoric has changed from the bishops' conference because previously the bishops would talk about category 1, talk about protecting the institutional church, would talk about number 2, protecting Catholic charities or Catholic hospitals, etc., but had been silent on private individuals, the folks in the pews. And really, the majority of the people against whom this mandate will fall. But if you read particularly the comments of Cardinal Dolan, he's mentioning the private business owners every time now. They're not just saying, well, just protect Catholic charities and the rest of you in the pews go out the door. So there is now a bit more of I would say it's intellectually a bit more consistent than previously. And it wasn't that the bishops were saying, well, yeah, throw those guys to the wolves, your flock, but just it wasn't really an issue that was on their minds. I know here in the state of Illinois, when there was a state contraceptive mandate, as many states have, it's not as sweeping as the federal mandate, but it's still troublesome. When the Catholic Conference of Illinois was lobbying against the bill back in, it was roughly 2004, there wasn't even a thought of saying, hey, what do we do with private individuals who have religious objections? It was more, well, make sure that Catholic Charities isn't a part of it, that religious nonprofits aren't a part of it. It was more neglect than anything else. But again, our church is not neglecting this issue now. And so that's a positive thing that we ought to be very thankful for. So that's the HHS mandate. And I think if you think about this as a dispute between worldviews, really, of what do we do with these 3 categories of institutions, the issue is, do we have a freedom to worship under the United States Constitution and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and similar laws? Or do we have the freedom of religious exercise, freedom of religion, which is not merely worship, but is an entire way that we live our lives? I'm assuming that this audience is going to be much more in favor of a comprehensive view of what it means to exercise one's religion, and that does not end when you walk out the church doors on Sunday. You don't have that right for an hour on Sunday morning and then lose it when you leave. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about what's going on right now in the Congress. And you may not have known this because I actually, when I found it out, I said, oh my goodness, are you kidding me? The bishops made this request. The bishops have asked the United States House and the Senate, but really the House, to stop all funding for the HHS mandate and to stand on that objection, even to the point of shutting down the government. Everyone remembers, Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton fought back in the 90s, and they shut down the government, and everything, it was crazy and all this. And it really wasn't that bad. They figured it out, and they moved on. But there's been this hesitancy. We don't want to shut down the government, don't want to shut down the government. And you wouldn't expect the Catholic bishops to say, well, yeah, shut it down. But they have actually, in their statements, said that. They have asked, and really the House leadership, because they're the ones that are really paying attention to this and have the ability to stop all the government. I mean, really, if they say, look, we're not extending the debt ceiling, say, and we're not going to pass that budget, we're not going to do anything unless you respect the religious freedom rights of Catholics and other Christians and other people of faith. But our bishops have actually asked for that. Now, that's something you should be very proud of, but also understand, whoa, I don't know of any other time that the bishops have ever made such a strong request. And while they had made the request before the last world-ending crisis, which I believe was earlier this year, We've got another period, another point in roughly October, where the Congress is going to have to make another decision about a continuing resolution to fund the government. And that is a point where you are starting to see movement to actually force the stoppage of the HHS mandate. And it may be tied in with stopping Obamacare generally, because this is a part of that whole scheme. But you are seeing that at least the HHS mandate part they may just halt it. And then, you're almost playing chicken with the president and saying, okay, we're just not going to send you anything. We're going to stop funding everything. Or maybe they'll send them certain things like keep the national parks open or keep the Veterans Administration open, keep the Social Security checks moving. But you're not, you're heading towards a showdown on the political side where you may be getting notices, maybe asked by your dioceses and others to, hey, start calling your legislators, tell them to, don't pass that continuing resolution. Stand up for this. If this is as important as everyone says it is, then someone at some point has to put their foot down. Otherwise, you just, things just continue to go on. I think it's wonderful that we're having this, this conference here in Illinois, because this is the most corrupt state in the country. So welcome to Illinois. We are not Detroit, but we're on our way. So that's, it's kind of a, being in this state, we've got a little bit of a microcosm of what's going on nationally, and we're a little bit ahead of the rest of the country in terms of our problems with some of the issues that we're facing. And so for me, I look at the solutions both here in the state, looking at the State House in Springfield and in Washington, that you are going to, on a political side, need to see your leaders put their feet down. We all know, and I think it's the country itself would, you get a majority of support for the polls to say, yes, we want to change. We want some sort of dramatic action to fix the issues that we're facing. As social workers, you guys see that our families are breaking apart, our communities are having trouble, our foreclosure rates are through the roof. And this is one little part of that. And so I hope that we're going to see some political leadership later this year on that front. But again, that's something that will come up to you soon enough. I did want to talk about, not to change the subject, but it's part of this same subject, the issues of same-sex marriage. And I don't know if anyone's dealt with this yet. There are certain places when you look at the options of what happens if we don't get the appropriate accommodations on the HHS mandate, you may see ministries trying to figure out either how to reorganize so as to no longer be Catholic, or to shut down, or in other ways, break apart or close because of a lack of accommodation. And an analog situation is under the same-sex marriage regimes of certain states. Here in Illinois, the bill being considered in Springfield is actually, would be, if passed, the least protective of religious liberty in the country. And you're getting some protections in other states, but you're not getting the protections that we would need in order to robustly exercise our ministries. And I can't speak to your professional obligations in terms of dealing with those issues of same-sex attraction, et cetera, and I've heard that you had another talk on that, so I'm glad that was covered elsewhere, because I'm not an expert in that subject. But you see in these states businesses, nonprofits, and others having to change their mode of behaving, or having to shut down, or again reorganize as a non-religious entity in order to accommodate for the issues that arise when you have same-sex coupling, same-sex parenting. Yeah, sure. Well, here in Illinois, we enacted civil unions back at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, went into effect, and actually a few months before it came into effect, the Attorney General of the state of Illinois opened an investigation and sent an accusatory letter to the dioceses of Springfield and, at least Springfield, bless you, Springfield and Joliet, accusing them of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and marital status. The idea being that they were running foster care programs where they would not recruit into foster care individuals who were living outside of a marriage. So whether same-sex or opposite sex at the time, because we had civil unions, so it was different from marriage. And so the Attorney General made an issue of that. Now, and of course, in Illinois, all of these key political figures who are in charge of these things are all Catholic, and proudly so. So it was an interesting thing to have Attorney General Lisa Madigan signing off on that. And then after a lot of deliberation, attempts to get the state to back down, the bishops of this state decided to sue on behalf of the Catholic Charities to ensure their right to provide foster care. If you took the 4 dioceses that were providing foster care, they had over 2,000 children. That would be larger than, I believe, the entire foster care systems of 13 states. Just was under the care of Catholic Charities. And of course, Catholic Charities in Illinois had actually founded foster care in this state over 90 years ago. The state of Illinois had only become involved in the last, say, 40 years, or a little less, actually. So you had to undergo litigation. It eventually got to the point where the governor of Illinois said, I refuse to contract with Catholic Charities because they will not recruit into their foster care system parents of the same sex, and who would live in same-sex relationships. But again, that was an issue we faced, and it got to the point we got a preliminary injunction, so we were able to stop the governor's action. And again, the governor is Pat Quinn, whose dad was the head of Catholic cemeteries for the Archdiocese of Chicago. So I mean, this is not just an average Catholic. This was a person whose dad was putting food on the table from the church. And he fought us vigorously, and we got a preliminary injunction. When it came to the end, we lost on a technicality that the judge didn't rule on our argument that, hey, you can't refuse to contract with us based on our religious objection, because Catholic Charities the 4 agencies were 4 of the top-ranked agencies in the state, and certainly they were the largest of the privates, other than Evangelical Lutherans, and the Missouri Synod Lutherans also had very large agencies. But we lost at trial. We went for an expedited appeal, and the state of Illinois said, we are taking all 2,000 of your children. We're transferring them to new agencies. We will do this prior to the court acting, before we could get the briefing done in the appellate court. And as well, and this is something that you won't necessarily read in the papers, but the agencies that they were transferring the children to were some of the worst-ranked agencies in the state. In fact, at least one of them had actually shut down their operation in the area where the Catholic Charities were operating, and all of the new agencies were based in Chicago, and they'd be serving children as far as 300 miles away. So that was the situation. We then effected a transfer of the kids, but the way that happened, the way that broke down, the Diocese of Belleville, which is southern Illinois, they no longer have a Catholic Charities affiliate. Their Catholic Charities affiliate, which they call Catholic Social Services, became non-denominational Christian. So the bishop left their board, and they actually left the church, generally. The Diocese of Peoria, local people in the community actually started a new nonprofit to care for the children. They transferred essentially all of the kids and all of their staff to a new nonprofit that is not Catholic. Diocese of Joliet effected a transfer to the Evangelical Lutheran Agency, which they had a relationship with, and that was, I believe, what happened in Springfield as well. So that, I mean, if you can imagine that happening on an expedited basis with 2,000 children's well-being at stake, along with thousands and thousands of foster parents, whether they had a kid in the home, there were placement right there, or just looking for children, you throw all of them up in the air. And the government was willing to do that with children on an expedited basis so as to avoid facing legal briefing. So I mean, really, that's what, when you ask for an example, the examples are rather dire. And I would say this, when you see the bishops respond nationally to the current threats to religious liberty, one of the bishops who went through the experience in Illinois in 2011 is Bishop Thomas Paprocki out of Springfield Diocese. He's both a canon lawyer and a civil lawyer. He was a Chicagoan, and he's called the Holy Goalie. He's actually, he plays hockey. He's a very unique man and a guy of a lot of talents and of great courage. And so after what happened in Illinois, he was put onto the ad hoc committee at the USCCB looking at these issues. And so you had this experience in Illinois where our Catholic elected officials put the screws to the church and really had no regard for the children in this. And they didn't back down. The other side did not back down. They were not going to. And so he was able to take that experience to Washington, where, of course, everyone there compromises, and it is an easy back and forth in the Washington political system. And normally there would be here. In fact, in the state of Illinois, often the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago is as powerful as the governor. No more, at least politically. And so that experience from Illinois, I believe, informed the way the bishops responded to the threats nationally, such that they have not backed down. They have not given an inch on this. They've been very reasonable. Said, well, okay, if you got an accommodation, let us look at it. But they have not been treated well by this administration. And you look at Cardinal Dolan, who's a guy who is a very good political bishop, and he has no illusions about what he's dealing with now. Some of these experiences really have, they've gone national now. But it's frightening how that could impact an entire ministry. I mean, if you think one day you're serving in the best way possible thousands of children, and then within months you've got to somehow rearrange your entire service delivery model. Or imagine a Catholic hospital. I mean, look, we're not going to shut them all down. All of a sudden, St. Jude's Hospital becomes, a Christ Hospital, something like that, or just some, Jonesville Community Hospital or something like that. So, yes.
You mentioned, we're not going to shut them all down. I'm curious, the talk has been...
We could shut them down. It hasn't happened uniformly that way.
I wonder if, especially a place like a hospital, is non-compliant. The talk has been, well, that they'll receive fines. And then my question is, if they decide not to pay these fines, what happens at that point? I mean, I can't imagine they would come into a running hospital with sick people and start, dragging people out and shut it down, literally with
Right.
So is there some other enforcement that they're talking about or not really?
You could use legal process to force the fines to be paid. It really, the thing is, that's the problem. Practically saying, well, we're just going to shut down the hospital. You can't. You can, however, there are legal ways that you can extract that money, whether you could force the sale of the building, but that doesn't, you could force it into bankruptcy. And then the bankruptcy judge would say everything operates just the same, except take sister out of the CEO position and put, Bob Smith. Take the cardinal off the board, put in whomever, and there you go.
So would the IRS...
Take all the crucifixes off the wall. I mean, can you imagine that?
I know, and I guess I wonder, is that actually going to happen? I mean, I can't imagine that would be good politically, but from what you're saying, it sounds like things like that have happened. So.
I wouldn't have thought I would have had to seen the expedited dismantling of large segments of Catholic charities, of dioceses in the state of Illinois, which is a very Catholic state, or at least the city of Chicago and Northern Illinois is very Catholic, and certainly the Catholic influences throughout the state. I wouldn't have thought I'd seen that either. And, and it wasn't all, so again, there are various options, there are various ways. I mean, I kind of gave you some of the examples of how they did it here. There were criticisms, obviously, of some of those ways of changing over, say in this case, the children. Belleville Diocese, there's no more Catholic charities. Poof, it's gone. In Peoria, there was criticism that they shouldn't have cooperated with a new nonprofit, the forming of it. And the other two dioceses just said, well, here are the kids. You've told us we have to transfer them. We can either transfer them to agencies that don't even have operations in our area and that are horribly, horribly mismanaged, or we can take them, and say, well, if you want to transfer them to Lutherans down the road that we deal with well. I mean, you've made the good point. They're not going to shut down hospitals. The government will figure out a way, again, through bankruptcy or whatever other, I don't want to predict what it would be, but that there are ways to do this. And, at some point, too, I mean, look, the government puts the screws to you. At some point, you have to comply or say, you know, we're out of this ministry. And again, what does the Catholic response demand? That is up to the bishop of each diocese and to the boards of directors of those institutions. Yes, Father?
There's a real interpretation, although the circumstances are slightly different, we consider ourselves more modern, but the reality is reality, and that is the world hates Christ, the world hates the church. What by the world I mean the prince of this world. The prince of this world is being called the devil. And because the world has negated the existence of the devil, we could say, how does this happen? Well, all we have to do is look at the history of the church within 150 years. I mean, we're talking only 150 years. The church in Mexico was completely persecuted. The social institutions in Mexico were shut down. Crucifixes were taken off the walls of schools. Nuns were taken out of their convents and raped, pillaged, and massacred. This was only 80 years ago, you know? And then we look at the Ukraine. The Ukraine went through the exact same things in 1916. All the social networks were shut down. Media was not allowed. The Catholic voice was not allowed at all by Russia, by the communists, you know? So I see these same things. And what has, as far as the Thomas More Center for Law and Justice, have you been able to build these publications, and do you use these as resources to try to teach your people in your community?
Well, and what I have a couple different perspectives here. And so I have both my lawyer hat with Thomas More Society. I also am a minor elected official in Lombard, Illinois on the village board, but am running for state representative, actually. So that's kind of it gives me a unique perspective both on the political side and then on the legal side. And of course, we advise legislators about the impacts of various bills. I would say this, I don't think we look to the historical examples in other countries as much as we might want, as much as we ought to. But I want to take it in a slightly different direction in that there are some good things happening in the legal structure. There are very bad things happening, but there are some positives that we have that some of those countries didn't have. The strength of our First Amendment to the United States, at least in its free speech and freedom to assemble, those perspectives are required for civil society, and they allow us to speak in the public square even if we're giving a religious message. And so we do have to fight hard to defend those rights. Those are, I believe the church has even, I think we've put it in there as a basic fundamental right, the right to free speech. That is something that absolutely has to be maintained. You saw the Supreme Court in the Hosanna Tabor case. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. That was from Michigan, where there was the Lutheran teacher who attempted to file discrimination charges against Lutheran school. And the Supreme Court overturned the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, overturned the trial court, overturned the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals unanimously and said, absolutely not. The federal government doesn't have a place in telling a church who its ministers should be. So we're getting some decent precedent there. Here's the problem. A conscientious legislator should keep a wide berth from constitutional rights, whatever their source, whether it's freedom of speech or the freedom of religion, should keep a wide berth. And unfortunately, we have folks today that don't respect these rights and instead try to tiptoe closer and closer and closer. And it calls up one of the first things we're taught in law school, which is hard cases make bad law. So when you're trying to figure out, well, where does the Constitution actually have a sphere where it is the absolute bare minimum, trying to figure out where that line is, courts are not that good at it. I mean, courts will do it, they have to sometimes, but they're not that good at it. Really, legislators should be respecting those lines and staying well away from them. Now, I will say positively on the HHS mandate, you're seeing a lot of positive response from various courts. Even in the 10th Circuit, where Hobby Lobby had been denied their preliminary injunction by the trial court and the appellate court, the 10th Circuit reheard it en banc. So that's all of the judges of the 10th Circuit. They reversed the panel and instead said, hey, excuse me, we're not going to force these guys to do this in the midst of their litigation. And Hobby Lobby was risking 1.7 million per day in fines. Because they have so many employees and they don't have franchise stores, they're all company owned, so all those employees are employees of Hobby Lobby. There are some positives here, but again, at heart, if you've got legislators that are not protecting the people, they can do a whole lot of harm. And I know that if you set me to work and said, well, here's precisely what the case law says about this particular right, I can draft up some pretty nasty legislation to take all of the area around that right if I were of a mind to do so. And there are folks on the other side who are of a mind to do so. They want to take the entire space for whatever reason. There are various reasons. Certainly Planned Parenthood had been one of the key drafters of the Obamacare law, and they knew this was in there, and they were planning on getting a big chunk of the preventative services. That was part of what was intended. I mean, that's public record. That's not something it's not like a conspiracy theory. Planned Parenthood took credit for this. And of course, their business model, they rely on getting reimbursements for these particular medical interventions. And in fact, the state of Texas they just settled with Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood had overcharged Medicaid $1.4 million or more. The settlement was $1.4 million repaid to the state of Texas that they had overbilled or fraudulently billed. So this is the sort of thing, and I would say too, I don't want to get too far off onto the Planned Parenthood side, but that's a cash business. If they're able to get insurance reimbursements, they get much higher reimbursements than having to charge people cash. It just is a practical matter, just by the way. Yes, go ahead.
First of all, I want to say thank you very much for all the work that you do with Thomas More.
And hi, Salatrice. I haven't seen you in quite a while. So yes.
It's an amazing, amazing organization, and I'm really grateful. One of the things that I've encountered very frequently with folks who are fairly well educated Catholics, and I live in Emmitsburg, and it's a very Catholic area. When I mention things that have happened and are happening, it's a shock to people. They had no idea, and like the issue with the foster care is not just happened here, that happened in the District of Columbia. Catholic Charities foster care program shut down. In Boston, I mean, this is happening. The federal government took away the funding for the anti-human trafficking resources with the church, even though they were clearly the highest quality provider of services, because they would not counsel for abortion. So it's happening all over the place already, and occasionally I'll make a statement, like it's becoming illegal to practice Catholicism in America, and people respond to me like I'm a doomsayer and catastrophizing, and that this is you're way out of the realm of reality, but things are happening that show that we could potentially go in that direction. We are going in that direction. So here's my question for you. Because so many people who feel strongly about these issues and are paying attention to them are not strictly motivated by a morality, but are also motivated by a political philosophy, that how do you recommend, as social workers especially, that we manage that? I think we have a skewed sample possibly in this room, but in general, the population at large of social workers in America are overwhelmingly Democrat. And so I want to be able to address these issues and talk about these issues without necessarily endorsing a Republican philosophy or a Democrat philosophy, but to keep, how do you recommend that we move forward in that regard?
Well, and you've brought up a good point in that you've got to be very specific about the complaint and educating friends, neighbors, and colleagues with specific examples. Politically, it is becoming much more difficult because the Democratic Party, at least through its elected officials, is more and more siding against us on these issues that traditionally Catholics were Democrats. So traditionally, you would not have seen Democratic Party members going in the other direction so strongly. They just wouldn't have been able to politically. They would have been crucified, well, figuratively crucified in their home parishes and in the neighborhood and what have you. You see here in Chicagoland, there's Congressman Dan Lipinski, who is a Catholic, but who is in favor of religious freedom and is pro-life. But he is a rare breed in Washington, D.C. This is a problem we're seeing throughout. After the Windsor decision came down on same-sex marriage, the Supreme Court had a lot of interesting things to say about the nature and purpose of marriage. But what they did was left the debate open. And right now the debate is still open. And the debate has to be joined by the folks in this room, by our co-religionists who are in the pews with us. And it really is a one-on-one conversion effort to our philosophy. Really, well, and really even here, I mean, we don't even have to convince people that the Catholic Church is right. Just say that they have a right to, we have a right to exist without these restrictions put on us. That having Catholic charities or other Catholic entities in foster care or in these ministries is a benefit to society generally. I mean, when I would go on and during that Catholic Charities lawsuit and even afterwards, I would be trying to speak the language that the reporters and the audience would most respond to, which is, we're the top-ranked service providers, and you're taking us out. We're serving everyone perfectly well. Same-sex couples that wanted to do this had numerous other entities that they could go to and be shepherded through the process, and it was just fine. We ensured no placement was ever disrupted based on our moral position. So I mean, you do have to, you've got to take the audience you're dealing with, whether it's your next door neighbor who is maybe a liberal Democrat who absolutely disagrees with you, and you just get them thinking a little bit on this. You know, from them to a more libertarian type, you've got to talk to them about the basic rights and things like that, and just say, well, you may be whatever, but at least we can agree that we should both have the space to operate. I mean, you have to deal with that in that way. It's tough politically because you have now, I mean, maybe it always has been, we have these districts gerrymandered such that a district may be solidly Republican or solidly Democratic, such that the person winning that primary is either the person furthest to the left or the person furthest to the right. And that is not necessarily the person who is most in accord with, say, a Catholic ideal or something like that. So all I can say is really the fight is on, and it is a hand-to-hand type fight. You have to, one at a time, convince people and serve people and help them. I mean, you're posting on Facebook, you're doing blog entries, you're tweeting. If you're not, you should be. Please do. Or learn at least some of them. I don't like to tweet, but I do the Facebook thing. But to kind of put forward your position and to educate folks wherever they are in whatever language they can best accept it. But yeah, and here's the alternative. If we don't do that work, there are people within the Democratic Party who are trying to drive out our perspective. So you've got to stop those folks. There are people in the Republican Party who are trying just as hard to drive out our perspective. As an elected official and now running for a higher office, I am constantly told what I should and should not say and what my positions should and should not be and why am I mean, obviously it's kind of tough for me because I'm in court all the time dealing with life, marriage, and religious liberty, so I really can't run from who I am. But I have so many people saying, well, de-emphasize it, don't talk about it, don't talk about it. It's got to be very targeted, got to do, and those are the messages our politicians are hearing. And someone will drew up a poll that was maybe poorly worded or it's just ignorant, and they'll say, well, look, here's the poll. You can't say anything about this. And that's what we're dealing with. So there's not a good answer. Well, let me put it this way. The answer is not complex. It's simple, but it involves one person at a time and convincing that person with whatever arguments will best get them from point A to point B. That's the only answer that I have. And that's the only thing that's going to cause a permanent, lasting change. And I would say, you should be politically active. You really should, at the local level, state level. A lot of times at the federal level, many of us are in districts where we can't make an impact for the most part because it's either going to be an R or a D, and the person's, once they're elected, they're in for 20 years. So if if your person lost the primary, you're pretty much out of luck with that particular elected official. But you can still work on the local level and the state level and what have you. I just a little more on this. I compare everything in life to football. As Sister Salvatrice and I met, we both have a Notre Dame connection, so this is not hard for her to believe. But in football, as in life, every play is not a Hail Mary. I mean, it's called a Hail Mary for a reason. It's because it never works, except for very occasionally. You take 2 yards, you take 3 yards, you get sacked, and you just keep fighting forward. And that really is how our politics have to be, our political approach, everything we do. We've just got to keep pushing forward. And when you get tackled, fall forward. Just always keep advancing. And eventually you score points. And that, the other side is doing that, and so we have to do it. Now, we can't give up. We can't be in any way uncertain. We're always uncertain because you just sit there and go, gee whiz, why am I doing this? You get up one morning and you're like, oh, I'd like to just go and find something, I don't know, something normal to do. And can I not be involved in this great fight for what it is to be America, what it is to live in this great country that our founders had this wonderful concept of, and that here we are over 200 years later trying to live it out. We can't. That's our calling. I will say, look, it's been worse for Catholics. We're not being used as human torches, so life's not that bad. So we have new challenges, but we have challenges that we can meet. So that's kind of where I would go with that. Now, I don't know if you guys had kind of trying to wrap it all up. I didn't know. I know there are other issues that Catholic social workers are dealing with, particularly in Maryland. When I was last at the March for Life, there was a photographer there. We were at an event, and she pulled me aside and said, I live in Maryland, and I photograph weddings. She said, there are groups actually testing the wedding photographers to see if they will film a same-sex wedding. And she said, what do I do? And I don't have a good answer for her. Because now, when you live in that area, you work in Maryland and Virginia and D.C., and now D.C. has same-sex marriage, as does Maryland. And if you've got aggressive people on the other side, it's very, very difficult. Again, we just have to continue to fight for the space to operate. I don't know. So as dire as it is, look, the fight is still on. If the Supreme Court wanted to force every state in the Union to have same-sex marriage, they would have done it. I mean, look, they had the best lawyers in the country. They had all the briefing you could ever want. They had protests galore. That was the time with the Windsor and Perry decisions that just came down. They could have closed the debate, or closed the debate as they did in Roe v. Wade back in '73, which wouldn't have really closed the debate, but would have legally stopped us. But they didn't. So, yeah.
Just a precursor to what's next in a matter of years.
Maybe. What they did, well, what the High Court really did was threw down the gauntlet for folks like us to say, make your case about the nature and purpose of marriage. Now, Justice Scalia thinks that it is a foregone conclusion, but you can't read that opinion and say, well, we're lost. I mean, certainly that was not a good opinion. It was poorly reasoned, and I still can't figure out what Justice Kennedy was deciding, all due respect to the justice. But they left the ultimate question to another day and let the debate continue. And it is still the law of 37 states that marriage is between a man and a woman. And in, I believe, 31 of those, it's a state constitutional amendment. So to change the law in those 30 or 31 states, you have to literally change the state constitution. So we are, in terms of raw state count, we're winning still, even with the setbacks we've had recently. So it's not done yet, but we certainly, if that wasn't a wake-up call for you, that it should have been. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think that's a very optimistic interpretation.
Yes, it is.
I don't think it's any accident that Kennedy was strongly opposed to the other decision, because he wanted to be able to outlaw, to use the kind of the Part 8 thing to rule it out altogether. And that's why I think Scalia went the other way. It was sort of strategic.
Well, here's the thing, though. The decision in Windsor could have made the same point that was made in the Prop 8 case, Perry. So there was nothing stopping the court from, in Windsor, using that logic,
But
which
we've
is
learned a few things since Roe, to me, which is
right.
what
But
we'll do, and if this is the way Scalia sort of puts it, you know,
sure.
You people in the States, we'll basically write it for you, we'll give you the arguments, the way to deal with it. All you have to do is fill in the blanks, and those laws will be overturned.
Well, here's the problem, though, and there are some points in the Windsor decision has some terrible language for us, but it also has some good language, which if you were reading the terrible language, you might have ignored because you're sitting there going, what in the world? You know, they're essentially calling us names, the justice was. But he did recognize in the decision that it is, quote, essential, unquote, to the traditional understanding of marriage that it involves a man and a woman. That is a holding that we had not necessarily had out of the Supreme Court, at least not recently. So by making that holding, he actually cut off, for the most part, any substantive due process attack in the future on marriage, because under substantive due process, it has to have been, you know, a traditional right. You can't invent new rights and say, oh, substantive due process requires this under the Constitution. The equal protection arguments, they were right there. They could have taken them. And again, next year, will they pop up and say, yep, equal protection requires it? They could. My problem is, look, you had Ted Olson, you had David Boies, you had the top lawyers in the country, you had the protests. I was there. We were the lawyers trying to deal with the permits for the National March for Marriage, and then there was the same-sex marriage advocates were all over the place. It was a mess. But they've had it. I mean, they had the hoopla, we had the big national thing, this, that, and the other. If they wanted to decide it, they could have. But I can judge what they wrote and what they did as, hey, they said, well, here's where we want to go. And I wouldn't dispute that, hey, you know, I'm sure the Supreme Court justices, like most politicians in this country, would love to end the debate. But they said, well, here's where we are. This is as far as we can go. If nothing changes in America, so in other words, if the folks on our side are able to stop the little bit of a wave that the other side has right now, then the Supreme Court's not going to be able to take the next step. Both based on what they've just written and based on what you said. They've learned since Roe. And the justices have repeatedly said, everybody from Ginsburg on over has said Roe was not well handled. It wasn't well done. Some have just said it's illegitimate. So if we do our work and stop the wave, then you will be able to roll some of this back. You know, you're going to have certain states where same-sex marriage is legal, and they're going to be accorded federal benefits. So your federal tax dollars will go to support those things. But right now, that's where we are. I mean, it's not a great place to be, but it is not like it's been done in other countries. I mean, it's not France, where the whole country is just now same-sex marriage. We still have the majority of the country not being on board with it. And if you look at the example here in the state of Illinois, they have supermajorities. There are Democratic supermajorities in the House and the Senate. In New York State, their Senate had actually had either a Republican majority or was very close. Here, there's no close. One party rules this state with an iron fist. The governor said he would sign it. The leaders of both caucuses in the legislature, both of the Democratic caucuses, Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, have said we're all for it. And they guaranteed it would pass in January, guaranteed it would pass in February. Absolutely, Joe Namath guaranteed that they would pass something before they went home in May. And instead, on that last day of the legislature, the House sponsor was up crying and he was unable to get the votes. So if this newly blue state we're able to hold something like this off, there is some hope. I mean, look, and we may lose in the fall, we may lose in the lame duck session in 2014, but the pro-marriage forces in this state were able to do a lot more than they should have been. So I don't know. That says to me that the people are not all in for this. And if we do our work of educating about the nature and purpose of marriage, we can win some victories.
Can I ask one other-
Sure, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Kathleen Arcus, is that her?
Yes, yes.
Who was one of the people who crafted DOMA, basically wrote a very pessimistic thing on it, saying it's all over.
Right.
Because, like, who's going to mobilize 250,000 volunteers in California when the whole thing would be written off because the public officials won't defend it and the courts will overthrow it? So
Yeah.
his point is, all the state laws and amendments is finished, and what we need is a federal amendment to the Constitution. And to go back to that strategy, and it seems like National Organization for Marriage is supporting that.
I think everyone's supporting a federal amendment, but that's just as part of our federal system, it is almost impossible to amend the Constitution unless you have vast, vast public support. And we don't have that right now. If we were to educate on the nature and purpose of marriage, could we get ourselves to a place where we were? I mean, 20 years ago, or maybe 30 years ago, you could have gotten a federal amendment. Of course, people would have laughed at you. They said, well, why is that a serious concern? Are you kidding me? Really? But now, that's not a possibility. Professor Arcus is, he's actually a friend of the Thomas More Society, so we love him, but at the same time, the state efforts are still very much valid, and they show that society is not going where the Supreme Court wants to lead it, or where certain politicians want to lead it, or where certain interest groups want to take it. And in California, there's two lessons. One, they did get the San Diego County Clerk. They've just gotten him on board, so they are actually going to be able to challenge the Perry ruling in court. In state court, they've taken it to the California Supreme Court. And there are some very strange things with Perry. The Supreme Court wiped away the Ninth Circuit appeal, but really should have. I don't see why they didn't just wipe away the whole proceeding. Because if there wasn't standing to appeal, there was no standing at the trial court level either. So all that trial and all the show trial that they had, really, they couldn't have had it under the federal system. If Article 3 of the Constitution prevents the high court and the appellate court, it prevented the district court too. But I will say, the folks on our side, we learn too. We may not be as well capitalized, but we are, occasionally we do some smart things. In Illinois, we had the same situation here where our state's attorney of Cook County refused to defend the marriage law. The Cook County clerk refused. Attorney General refused. Well, we got two downstate county clerks immediately to come into court, partially because we have a good relationship with our elected officials and we keep up communications. And we're now up to 5 who are defending the law. So we knew we're not going to make the same mistake that they made in Perry. Look, we're going to get in with elected officials as quickly as possible. We learn, and all I can say is the fight's still on. And I don't think it's in any way lost right now, but it is at a point where we have got to do, everything possible to teach about the nature and purpose of marriage. From a civil society standpoint, that mostly focuses on children. From a Catholic standpoint, of course, we have a more robust understanding of the unitive and the procreative together. So, who was up first? Or you haven't asked a question yet.
So I need your Law 101
Okay.
answer to it. It seems to me that, and this republic, if the voters vote unanimously or 51-50 for a given law, the Supreme Court has the power to say, you've got it wrong. Your opinion is unconstitutional. Is that correct?
Well,
Yeah. Matter what the California electorate voted. It seems to me.
Well, the Supreme Court is supposed to take a very restrained view of the constitutionality of a law. So every law is presumed to be constitutional, no matter how crazy it looks. Yeah, so it's supposed to be presumed to be constitutional. And in this particular case, say sexual orientation, well, and I guess I'll give you a little more, it might be Law 101 or it might be 201 or 301. under the Equal Protection Clause, you've heard, everyone has an equal protection right. We have a right to equal protection. The thing is this, the Equal Protection Clause imposes different levels of scrutiny as to reviewing the constitutionality of a law. So if it deals with race, strict scrutiny. If that law deals with race, it had better be the least restrictive possible way of doing something. Otherwise, we're going to strike it down. If it deals with gender, it's actually intermediate scrutiny. Only race gets the top scrutiny there. But you get intermediate scrutiny for certain other things, gender, alienage, that sort of thing. Everything else is something called rational basis, which is as long as there is some reason that, to back up the law, just some reason. Even if it's disputed, even if it's, they might not be right, but, it was at least within reason, the law should be upheld. And so same-sex marriage laws at the state level, well, no, it actually should be the bottom, rational basis. Well, up to this point, state marriage laws have all been reviewed under rational basis review. And even that Windsor decision on DOMA, it wasn't on the point that we're dealing with here, which is it rational to keep marriage to a man and a woman? And again, to me, how do you answer that? You talk about the nature and purpose of marriage. And so that's how the court is supposed to deal with it. Just say, look, as long as there's a rational basis, and the folks in this room could probably list a lot more than I can for why it's best for children to be raised by their natural mother and father, married and in a low conflict marriage. That on average you get the best results. That's reason number one for civil society to say, hey, here's why we have marriage between a man and a woman, why we put it up on a pedestal, why we try to encourage it and give it tax breaks and all sorts of things. And as someone who does a little bit of legislating, I can say, yes, here's why. And there might be wonderful things about other arrangements of individuals in whatever combination or however, but I know that this one has a great benefit to society. I know that in every study that's credible, the natural married mother and father, biological parents of a child in a low conflict marriage do the best. Those kids do the best on average. So that should be the way it's interpreted, and we have pretty consistently in the federal and state courts, it has been interpreted that way.
Excuse me, on
Right.
what basis did they say that California's law was, or was it unconstitutional?
Judge Vaughn Walker was a trial judge. He actually had a full trial and said that the law should be evaluated at a heightened standard. So once you introduce the heightened standard, that does change the calculus. Then you've got to look at evidence, and he held a show trial. And of course it later came out that he does live with his long-term male partner. So it was an interesting case. And then he decided the case and then retired. So it's a very odd case, that Perry case. And then up on the Ninth Circuit, they didn't affirm all of the things he did with the show trial. They said, well, because California had already had some sort of a domestic partnership type arrangement that you couldn't have the one and then restrict marriage, restrict the title of marriage. So they had a very limited ruling. And actually, during the Supreme Court arguments, they really trashed that ruling of the Ninth Circuit. They said, well, wait, so if you give the folks who are lobbying for same-sex civil unions and partnerships and then eventually marriage, they said, wait, you mean if you give them half of what they want, you now are unconstitutional and you have to give them everything they want? That makes no sense. You've given these folks what they want politically, and now they're going to come back and say, well, hey, wait, you changed the law for us, so now you have to change the law some more. So that was really not well taken by the High Court. So, yes?
I wonder where the military community fit in all this, because we talked a lot about states, but it seems like it's directly connected to the federal government and directly connected to whatever administration it is. So it seems like if you're going to make a 7-year commitment, you might know 2 of those years who's going to be your boss, so to speak, and the other 4 years you're just kind of leaving up in the air thinking, for example, if you're a military chaplain, I don't know if I'm going to be discharged if I refuse to take a same-sex couple on a weekend retreat for couples. So,
Well,
any comments on
that has been a huge issue that has erupted lately. We don't do any of that area of law, but I have been monitoring the situation, and it's frightening how much life has changed for military chaplains in just the last few years, where you've got individuals who have been punished for expressing what is the traditional Christian view of marriage or of homosexual activity. That's another thing. I mean, let's not even go to the nature of marriage, just the nature of what conduct is, within the traditional Christian morality and what is not. And certain, frankly, in the Catholic Church, we're much more nuanced about the way we deal with these issues, or maybe there are certain denominations that are very, very strong about, that is a sin, you're going to hell. And the chaplain has a right to preach what he wants to preach, and yet, the head of military chaplains is doing what the generals and the president tells him to do, and they are directly conflicting. And it is a tough spot for a chaplain to be in right now. And I know my brother-in-law served in the Army for 8 years, and I had even started I was in the seminary for a little bit, and I did an internship, military chaplaincy internship, and the one guy that a service member can go to that is absolutely confidential is the chaplain. So that is a relationship that if you destroy that, you are hurting your military generally. I mean, and along with really diminishing religious liberty and forcing chaplains to, how does the Archbishop of the Military Services allow his guys to go and serve in the armed forces when they may not be able to preach the gospel? How do we even do this?
And I guess my thought was it seems relevant to military social workers as well, which there's a limited community.
Okay.
I mean, it seems like there would be parallels that they wouldn't feel protected because, this person's an officer. Maybe they would, someone else would not. So I don't know.
Well, and I asked the question, too, of how do you guys deal with situations where you're faced with folks doing, or living lifestyles or in the midst of behaviors you may say this is not good for you, and yet the law may declare that not only is the relationship not bad for them, but it's legally protected, we're going to enshrine it and celebrate it. I mean, how do you as professionals counsel or work with those folks? It's a very, I don't have answers for you on that front. I will say that. They are very difficult situations. And I know of there was a young lady in Michigan, I believe, who was, I believe she's an evangelical Protestant who was in I don't know if it was an MSW program or what the program was, but she had, it was an MSW? Okay. Was it Western Michigan, something like that? Right, because she was not, her personal religious beliefs, which up until a few years ago were accepted by the rest of society for the most part, required her to, I'm going to counsel you that this isn't good. You've got some odd circumstances that we're going to have to deal with. And from a legislative perspective, really, with some of the decline that's occurring, we have to carve out spaces for us to operate while we regroup and then try to take back the culture. Again, we're not Human Torches right now. We're free to have a meeting here and not, we are underground, but we're not really underground. So we have space to do what needs to be done, but we have absolutely got to redouble our efforts right now and to continue. If we don't know why we believe certain things, and you guys in this group, you see the practical impact of how moral beliefs, the moral teachings impact people's lives. So I'm preaching to the choir, and you could probably tell me a lot more than I can tell you about this on a practical level. But we do have to figure out really good, concise, and convincing ways of explaining our teachings and why we believe what we believe, and getting that across both the folks in the pews, with us, our friends, our neighbors, and one at a time. So, Father.
One of the things, I'm a missionary, and it's hit and run. Get in, preach the truth, and get out.
It's easier that way, yeah.
But it's really funny because a while back I was reading some reflections from the Communist Party circa 1957, and they said that the He's like, give them everything and then get out of here.
Yeah.
Give them everything. And it's a thinking kind of issue, you know, but I do fear for Greece, you know, because there is going to come a day when a homosexual couple walks into the office and asks to be married.
Yeah.
And that is going to be the spark that ignites, I think, revolutionary.
Well, and that, right now, I mean, I guess I can speak to the Illinois debate over same-sex marriage because I'm right in the middle of it. And the folks on the other side keep saying, well, we're not going to force your pastors to say same-sex weddings. You know, like they're doing us a favor. It was like, oh, here's an accommodation for you. Like, you know, have you read the Constitution? You know, you can't do that. You couldn't force us to do that, at least under current law, current interpretation of the law. But they see that as that's what freedom of religion entails. We're not making your pastor do it. Now, they might say, well, his assistant, his secretary has got to, she's got to be able to live however she likes, and, the first grade teacher's got to be able to live, bring in her lesbian spouse and their kids and all that, and that's got to be just fine. But again, we have to just continue the blocking and tackling of fighting it. And I will say one wonderful thing about the marriage debate is that we are having to remember why we teach what we teach and why it is what it is. I mean, the Holy Father and the Holy Fathers, several back, have been talking about the fact we no longer have a Christian culture. We can't assume the things we used to assume. So we have to start at the basics, teach, and continue to teach. And we're having to, but at least now, I mean, when folks in some of these states, the rest of the states, the non-Illinois, the non-New Yorks, the non-Californias, folks are having really good, robust debates on marriage. Actually, we are here in Illinois, too. They're really talking about the nature and purpose of marriage and getting into it and talking about the importance of moms and dads. And that's, folks' eyes are opening and saying, oh, yeah, I might have voted for the constitutional amendment, that came down a couple of years ago, but I was thinking, well, maybe that wasn't a good idea. Now you're telling me, oh, yeah, moms and dads, that makes some sense. And they don't have to, whatever their religious beliefs or lack thereof, they can at least come to that natural understanding that, that our religious beliefs are in accord with. So I don't know. That is a gift that we've been given, that we have to educate on this core foundational unit of society. So, all right, more questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm wondering about this question of spite, or how you put it. What is the legal force? Because John Walker made that point too, and so did Kennedy. It's a rational, spiteful. Well,
Yeah.
that sounds to me like an ad hominem fallacy. You ignore the argument by focusing on the motives. Would the same thing apply to a silly law or a paranoid law? I mean, what are the motivations have to do with it?
Well, there is some relation to constitutional law, where if you show that you were directly trying to discriminate against a particular group, that can impact the way that you consider the restriction. But even so, in the legal framework, it shouldn't have changed the analysis here. So Vaughn Walker, I mean, his decision has not been affirmed and is not in accord with the vast majority of the decisions it issued. So Vaughn Walker being the trial judge on the Prop 8 case. And his decision was not affirmed on appeal because the appeal's been wiped away altogether. So he really is an aberration, and I think we should continue to treat him as such until other courts go that way. But I don't think they're going to, or at least if they do. Kennedy, he did. He talked about that, and that should trouble us. At the same time, it was not, the way he used those words was totally tied in with this issue of federalism and the sovereignty of the state to define what marriage is. And so he was saying, well, yeah, it's spiteful to say that when it's been legally recognized by a state that you're going to pick these marriages and not take those. That was his statement. Now, for us who have a more proper understanding of the nature and purpose of marriage, we would disagree with the justice. We think there are perfectly good reasons to say that certain relationships are marriage. I would also say, just as an attorney, the fact that the Defense of Marriage Act, Justice Kennedy didn't like the fact that the Defense of Marriage Act impacted over 1,000 different federal statutes. I'd say, as an attorney trying to interpret what the heck does each statute mean, it's better for me to have a nice bright line test where I can say, okay, same-sex couple is coming in saying they get these benefits under the the ERISA law with retirement benefits and things, and then they want these benefits or they get those. Military issues, who's a spouse and who gets the TRICARE and whatever. It's better just to say, look, we're not going to wade into that. We know what marriage is traditionally. We're going to recognize those, and the rest of them, we'll keep fighting it. And then when you get enough people that want same-sex marriage, then you come into Congress, you change the law. If you don't, then the law is staying as is. If it's a fad, as we would hope it is, it'll just go away. So that's kind of where we are. But again, with Justice Kennedy's decision, you can't disconnect that from the constant references to the state's right to define marriage and 4 separate references to the broad sweep of DOMA, over 1,000 statutes. It was kind of reading that opinion was like trying to, look at the entrails of an animal and divine the future. But that is the best I can give you. I'm sorry but I don't know how to compare it to anything more frivolous. Again, I do have to say that Windsor opinion, there are certain tests for constitutionality under the substantive due process, under equal protection. He didn't use any of them. He just kind of pulled a few things together, said irrational, hateful, spiteful, and we're like, what? And that was that. Yeah.
For more information about this annual conference, please contact Catholic Social Workers National Association at www.cswna.org.